Why does God allow suffering? If God is good, God is the highest goodness, so why would that goodness allow suffering? And it might be good to first identify the difference between pain and suffering, because they are two distinctly different things. Pain is a little bit easier to recognize the reasons for it. Pain is an indicator that we have fallen off the path of balance. Pain is a tool that karma flows through. Karma is the method for creation to bring us back to a space of balance. It's a method to help us realize when we've fallen off the path, when we have fallen into a state of harm of self or others through our choices. And that pain helps us to recognize, hey, something's off. So we can look at this simply of eating something that makes us sick or not feel well, something that's not designed for us to eat, and we feel poor after eating it. We've all been there in those moments where we've binge eaten something that does not feel good. And so we experience that pain, and it's not God punishing us. It's just simply an indicator to say like, hey, you're straight off the path, and here's a modality to get you back on it, so that I can remember like, hey, I could go through and have that experience again, but I don't really want to experience that pain. I would like to stay in that space of balance and health and well-being. So I'm going to avoid that one. So that's where we can see the goodness behind something like pain. So God is definitely working through that. Traditional religious ideologies portray God as if God is actively doing these things in our lives, which of course there's divine presence moving. However, the mechanisms such as karma and this pain, that's not requiring some conscious effort on God's part or any being's part to make that happen. That simply is just how the system is. So this system is so perfect, this creation is so perfect, that we have these mechanisms in place, the karma to bring us back into the path of balance, and then the dharma, on the other hand, to encourage us to stay on that path. Dharma is what gives us that satisfaction and that validation and helps propel us further to stay on that path. So it really is these two mechanisms in play at all times, and it's our choice which one do we want to have in our lives. And of course, it's a spectrum. It's not something that we're 100% one way or 100% the other, not usually. So it's a spectrum, and each action, each decision is kind of an indication of what we're going to receive for that. But just wanted to portray that it's not like God sitting there judging and saying, oh, you did wrong, so now I'm going to send this pain. It's like, no, this is how our body, so just going back to the food item, this is how our body is made. So if we choose to ignore the natural ways that our body exists, and we choose to eat something that does not align within our highest vibration within our body, then we experience the pain because we've fallen out of alignment with that. I mean, people have an easy time seeing that if I put diesel in a gasoline tank instead of regular gasoline, even though it's supposed to take regular gasoline, the system's not really going to work. You know, it might fire some, you might get some use out of it depending on a lot of factors or the mixture or whatever, but eventually that's going to cause a breakdown. You know, and this is a simple cause and effect, which is how creation works as well. So we don't need to view it as if there's some punishing being that's forcing us to do these things. It's simply just cause and effect. And it's all built by us. We are no different than this divine creator. We are simply an aspect of that divine creator here experiencing creation from our unique perspective to remember who we truly are and come back to that realization. So the system is all built by us. So we don't need to take on this pity party or play the victim as if something else is doing this to us. We did this. We chose to have this immersive, full range experience where we get to experience the consequences of our choices, both feeling comfortable and feeling uncomfortable. So that would be, again, the karma, uncomfortable, and the dharma, feeling comfortable. And it's like the goal is that bliss, to stay in that space of bliss at all times. But of course we wander and we stray, and that's okay too. It's all learning. So just wanted to define what is pain to kind of lead into the definition of suffering. So suffering is slightly different than pain. Pain is like a momentary indicator. It's like that thing that brings us into that state of awareness. Suffering is when we have adopted pain so much it becomes a consistent part of our life, becomes a consistent part of us. It's a prolonged pain. When we ignore the pain, when we ignore the indicators of what pain is bringing us, and we stay in that space of pain, then that's when suffering begins. And suffering is completely a choice, all because we've ignored those indicators to get us back onto the path. So therefore we suffer. So there really is no need. There will always be pain, to some degree. There will always be some indicator of when we start to veer off. Many people have played the little board game Operation, or at least are familiar with it, to where you're trying to delicately take these, which is kind of a gruesome game now that I think about it, but trying to take these organs out of this man, and if you touch the metal to the side, it makes a buzzing noise, which is quite intense if you're trying to do so carefully. That's the same thing that pain does for us, is if we're not doing it carefully, if we're not staying in that space of balance and we hit the wall, there's that pain to bring us back. So again, suffering is when we ignore that. So if that metal tool playing that game of Operation, if we just laid it on that metal side and it's just making that horrible noise consistently, that would be suffering. So there's no need for suffering, because if we're paying attention, if we're conscious, which the whole kind of point of this is to step back into our conscious being, our conscious self, then we're never going to allow that pain to lead to suffering. That pain will always be a short-term indicator that something needs to change. I need to pick the tool up. I need to move it in a way to where it's not making contact with that loud buzzer creating source. And therefore I don't have the suffering of this just annoying noise continuing to proliferate. The only reason we have suffering is because we have ignored pain. We have ignored karma in a myriad of ways consistently. So going back to the question, why does God allow suffering? And I guess the answer really is God allows anything. Free will is paramount. Free will is absolute. So God will never step in and break that free will access, our choices and what we'd like to do. That's another sort of perfect mechanism of creation, is it gives us exactly back what we put into it. So if we are manifesting that frequency, if we're resonating at that frequency of fear, then guess what? Creation's going to give us more of that. Creation's going to give us more fear, and without even hesitation, without even an "Are you sure?" Are you sure you want to do that? You might get that helpful hint from using or going off some site somewhere online. You might get that little prompt. Are you sure you want to leave this? Are you sure you want to do this? But we don't get that in creation. It's just boom. You want this, you get it. So why does God allow suffering? Because free will is absolute. If God stepped in and started to remove aspects of this free will, then we would not be free. You can't have a halfway. You can't have freedom partly. You can't even have mostly free and still be free. Free will is 100% free in all moments, where the choices can be made and changed and shifted and moved in whatever direction at whatever point in time. That is the only way that free will is absolute. And free will is paramount. It is like a foundational part of this conscious experience. We have that free will. And so that's where it gets kind of tricky. So it's not God allowing suffering necessarily. God allows the potential for suffering, but we are the ones who create it. So we don't have anyone else to blame for suffering existing except ourselves. Suffering doesn't have to exist if we learn to utilize karmic consequences, especially when they're just small, when they're just little nudges and nods to say, hey, like, you're falling off the path. Okay. I hear you. Let me get back on. If we use those little indicators and stay balanced, then we don't have to move into suffering. It is a very achievable and realistic goal to end all suffering, to where there is no suffering in this experience. But it does require conscious effort. It requires consistent paying attention to these indicators of pain whenever they show up. That's why the lies are so pervasive of getting us to believe that we are a worthless sinner. On one hand, from the religious sense, we are just an insignificant thing that God just judges and whatever else, and we're powerless. Or on the other hand, that we are just some random happenstance of evolved pond scum turning into monkeys and then turning into us, and that we're just on some far off distant speck in the universe and could be wiped out by an asteroid or aliens or anybody at any point in time. Either of those narratives are just beaten into our head consistently, because when we don't realize that we are powerful, we don't realize that we are co-creating this experience every step of the way, and that we are inviting whatever experience is. We have the free will to change it at any point in time. Then we start to ignore all of these indicators. We ignore the pain. It leads to suffering. We fall into the victim narrative. We believe the victim narrative that's pushed onto us, and we embody it. And then that loop of suffering just continues, and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Oh, woe is me. Oh, then I experience more misery. Oh, woe is me. More misery. Oh, wow. It just seems to continue that way. So what was a very helpful teaching tool to get us out of that state then becomes a proliferating downward spiral. And even that is not lost. We will eventually hit whatever sort of rock bottom moment we need to hit to turn the ship around. But it certainly does feel, if we're staying in that victim mindset, if we're believing these lies that we are powerless and ignoring the fact that we are an aspect of the divine creator and we have all of that power within us, we empower ourselves. But if we ignore that through these lies, then it just becomes continual suffering, seemingly, until we decide to step out of it. So that's why, of course, these lies are so pervasive and taught everywhere in every institution. The quote-unquote science route teaching the evolution mindset that we're just insignificant and life is just happenstance, and then the religious worthless inner idea all keeps us primed and ready to lock into the victim mindset or the apathetic mindset of just like, fuck it, nothing matters. So why even bother trying? Why even pay attention to what I'm doing? I might as well just enjoy myself, engage in the sensitive pleasures of the flesh and ignore the rest. So it makes sense why we've fallen into this way of being, and why the slippery slope got more slippery as we went along. But now we're starting to remember that I had the key all along. I had the ability to change this all along. So I need to get out of the victim mode and start taking responsibility and start making these changes. And recognize that I, as this individualized egoic character construct, am not exempt from the collective experience that we're all having, because that's all me too. So if me is suffering anywhere, then that suffering is going to bleed into the collective experience that we're having. I don't need to get caught up in the idea that I can somehow just separate from all of that and alleviate all my suffering. We can, to a degree, by that framework perspective shift, recognizing that suffering is only there when we possess it. And at the same time, the external circumstances might not shift immediately just because I have that mindset shift, because we are all collectively bound, and because it exists in multiple timelines, multiple ways. So doing what I can in all moments to shift in that way, but not letting the external circumstances dictate or lead me to a state of apathy or giving up. Whatever I'm doing, I'm chipping away at that collective suffering. So even if I'm still suffering myself or going through some very challenging situations, I'm chipping away at that. And my perspective around that, to say, okay, I don't need to suffer because of this, even just regardless of how challenging that situation is, I'm still going to move forward. I'm still chipping away at that big collective suffering and what we're going through. So it gets nuanced, and people have a hard time with this concept, especially when you're dealing with innocence, when you're dealing with people who maybe can't physically protect themselves. Why would they suffer? Why would a child be born with a birth defect? Why would they experience the horrific choices of their parents with injecting them all of these experimental poisons? Why would that child who's done nothing in this lifetime to deserve that, why would that lead to this child suffering? Or why would anyone experience suffering seemingly outside of the circumstances that they've encountered. This gets into potentially triggering perspective. And it's hard to talk about this, especially with someone who is deeply within a bout of suffering. There's a lot of pain, there's a lot of trauma, and it seems to just be continuing. So it's difficult to talk about. However, it doesn't change the fact that this is consistent. We have to really zoom out past this single lifetime and past our individualized experience and recognize that this is a collective experience, and it exists in all timelines, in all ways. So our soul signature exists in infinite timelines and infinite ways. We are just here tapped into the one consistently. Of course, we can tap into all of them. So wherever my soul signature is, and however many other ways, it is still accruing karma wherever else it lies. So we've heard the terms, maybe past life karma. It gets hard to conceptualize because it's not really the past. It all is here and now. But just for the sake of viewing it from a mental perspective, from our limited minds, we can't really conceive of that multi-layered experience where everything is now. It's very, very challenging to do that, and we can really only go so far in that. So just imagining the linear perspective as if it is a quote-unquote past life, the karma that has been accrued during that lifetime has to be rebalanced at some point. So when we start to see this from that higher lens, that this soul signature exists in infinite variations, infinite timelines, and is experiencing that those free will choices and consequences in whatever capacity, then it starts to bring us back into the reasons, not that we need to justify or figure out all the reasons why suffering might exist, but this leads to a knowing of okay, there is nothing that exists outside this balance, this continuous rebalancing of nature. This natural creation is constantly working to bring itself into a state of balance. So anything that exists outside of that balance is going to be rebalanced. So if our soul signature in another timeline has operated in a space moving out of balance, there has to be a correction point. And sometimes the greatest way to experience a correction is for that soul signature, your soul signature, to experience the consequences of those actions in a different lifetime. And I'm not saying this because even talking about this can lead people to a state of feeling helpless or hopeless, as if I'm just a victim to some other lifetime where I've made choices that I'm now experiencing the consequences of, and I can't do anything about that. And I'll just put it very bluntly that kind of attitude is only going to perpetuate that rebalancing. So the point of feeling that pain and those consequences is to bring balance back into the self, to recognize, okay, this is happening for a reason. I don't need to know all the reasons why, but I need to stay in that space of trust that this is happening for a reason. I'm here to learn something. I'm supposed to experience something from this. And so that's taking it from the perspective of past life experiences and why something might be happening. Looking at this linearly, which linear time does not exist in this way, but just from a conceptual point of view, looking at our future lives, or even just the future timeline in this particular moment of where I'm at now and where I need to get to. This is all being considered in the grand cosmic experience that we're having. This is explained very well from a human design perspective, especially for anyone who has a 6 in their chart. So if you haven't looked into human design, is a phenomenal way, modality of looking into how we show up. It takes astrology, sacred geometry, and a whole wide variety to determine what our soul signature is like here in this space. And one of those factors is the number 6, which is the role model. And one of the aspects of the role model is quite a lot of challenges early on in life. It's a period of often claimed to be 50 years before those challenges really balance out to the point where that individual is able to utilize what was learned from those challenges. So it just shows the sort of higher purpose behind why somebody might experience something that we would akin to suffering or pain. Why somebody might experience challenges within that. It's to get to that space where they can embody that highest role model character so that they can bring those lessons to others. Because again, we're all connected. So we got to get away from this individualized idea that it's all about me, because it's truly all about us, which is all you. I mean, it's just you an infinite number of perspectives. So that also adds another contributing factor to why something might have happened. Again, we don't have to know exactly why. It helps to just give that grace and allow us to lean into that trust that everything is happening for a reason. So I might go through this experience so that I would learn what it's like, and I might experience some hardship because of it so that I can help others avoid that hardship. And I'll just give a personal example. I don't have a 6 in my profile, but everyone goes through these lessons so that we can have that under our belt and be able to share with others. So just back to the personal example, when I shifted my diet and my food choices away from the conventional eating everything, all sorts of processed foods, all sorts of garbage all the time, when I shifted out of that and into a frugivore way of being, eating, I started on 100% raw, and for the most part, I do stay very consistently raw. When I first stepped into that, because it was sort of uncharted territory for me, I went hard and fast. When I made up my mind, I dropped alcohol, I dropped all animal products, meat, dairy, eggs, I dropped all processed foods, I dropped all cooked foods for quite a while, and I went straight into it. And I experienced the state of euphoria and heightened sense of awareness for a period of about 2 months, I'd say. And then after that point, it started to kind of go downhill, or it felt like that, where I lost a lot of strength, I lost a lot of weight, I lost a lot of hair, and I was able to pull myself back into balance to where my body could slow down by going back into some cooked foods for a period of time. And now I'm in a space, I'm glad that I went through that, because now I'm in a space to where my body is balanced, to where I can go prolonged periods of time 100% raw and not have those same feelings come back. So just finding that balance with that as my body is transitioning back to this state where it can truly optimize and utilize these higher forms of food. So my point is why I went through that experience is so that I could help anyone else going through that same sort of transition, to where I can warn people, maybe it's not best to go hard and fast all of a sudden, everything all at once. Now, some people maybe still want to do it that way, and I don't think there was anything wrong with me doing it, but it did give me that experience that I wouldn't have had any other way to help people transition a little bit more slowly, so that these sort of hard and fast consequences of biting off perhaps more than I could chew, I can impart that wisdom to others. So that's my point is, and we can all think of things in our lives where we've gone through them and it might have been very difficult. And in the moment we were experiencing, we're like, why is this happening to me? Like, what is this? I didn't do anything to deserve this. And then it might be years later when we're imparting that wisdom of what we learned, overcoming that challenge, we're able to give that to somebody else. That's when it makes sense. That's when it clicks. That's when you realize, oh shit, that's why I went through that. That's why I went through those things, in order to learn so that I can impart this wisdom on others, because we are all connected. So if any of us are suffering, or any of us are setting ourselves up to suffer, making choices where we're leading and engaging and working towards that path of suffering, then we're all suffering. It is where we go one, we go all. It is a collective experience that we're having. So again, taking a step back and viewing the possible reasons of why I might be experiencing this thing that I view as very challenging, can be because of past life rebalancing. It can be because of future possibilities, future timelines opening up. And it's all for this collective assistance. It's also that we can rebalance as a whole. And God never gives us more than we can handle, right? So we never earn more than we can deal with at any point in time. So those who experience quite a lot of hardship, I imagine at a soul level are extremely powerful to be able to handle those kind of things, and are being set up to dispel some of that rebalancing that needs to occur, but also to learn those lessons so that balancing can be brought into others. It can really be brought into a space to where others can benefit from that, to where a lesson learned by somebody, one individual, can then be shared with countless others, to where others don't have to go through that same. So as far as the collective benefit, the goodness, God is good. So moving towards that rebalancing back to inherent goodness around for all, it is achieving that. It's moving through that. So these kind of things just help to give us a broader view of why something might be happening. And again, we don't have to figure out the exact reasons. It's just trusting that this system, this beautiful creation that God has given us and moved us into, is so perfect. It's so perfect. So nothing is ever happening to me. It's all happening for me. It's all happening for us to continually bring us back into this state of balance. When we recognize this, it actually allows us to, no matter what we're going through, no matter how difficult it is, no matter if we're being strung out on a torture table, probably the most extreme example we can imagine, even in that moment, we can still be outside of suffering. We can still let suffering go, even in that moment, trusting that whatever needs to happen is happening. So even if I'm experiencing that, perhaps that's the catalyst, just using that hypothetical example. Say somebody captures me and is torturing me. Maybe that story will catalyze others to rise up if there was some oppressive force that was leading to that form of suffering, that form of torture. And we can look even realistically at the example of the children. Why are children suffering? Why is there a reality that exists where children are tortured and harvested for their life? Why does that even exist? Well, the fact that it happened is catalyzing others to a space of realization so that we are moved to action and assist in rebalancing this. And so it's unfortunate that it had to get to that point, because we were ignoring the indicators of karma to keep us in a state of balance. And we were allowing the suffering to proliferate. So we don't have anybody else to blame but ourselves. And not that we take on shame and guilt. We don't need that. But just take responsibility and recognize that it is essential that we have a catalyst to move us into a state of action. And if it had to get to the point where children are suffering to that degree to encourage us to move, then we chose that. If it could have been any other way, it would have been. And you can look at a smaller example of why would God allow a child who is not making their own choices to receive an experimental injection, to receive all sorts of birth defects or potentially die from that? Why would that be allowed to happen? But you take that example and you recognize the effect that might have on those parents and anyone else who is aware of that story. And all of a sudden, that instance becomes a catalyst for those parents to speak out against these experimental injections. It becomes a story for people in that local community to recognize. And it becomes an opportunity for us to step away from this continuous suffering of abandoning our sovereignty and giving our power away to this medical mafia. So when we take a step back and view these things not from a specific lens of one instance, one lifetime, and look at this from a grander scale, and stop getting into this idea that death is some ending point. This is all a collective experience that we're having. Then we can get away from this lower victim mentality mindset that keeps us trapped into these ideas. And even getting trapped into those ideas of victimhood, that is suffering. And God's not doing that to us. We are doing that. We take that on and we assume that position and we start to spin in our mind in that space. And then we prolong and extend our own suffering. So again, it becomes a choice to let go of that. It becomes a choice to recognize that whatever is happening is exactly what's needed to bring us into a space of balance. And so the reason why there exists so much suffering now is because we've abandoned for so long our conscience, that inherent force within us that's always bringing us back to a space of balance, that knowing that something is wrong. We all have that within us. We don't have to define that. There doesn't have to be laws to define what goodness is and what is right. We know this, but somewhere along the way, we said it wasn't important enough. It wasn't important enough to do what was right. And we would just abandon that. We would just allow whatever to happen. Oh, that's not my problem. Oh, it doesn't affect my family, so what do I care? Oh, it's not my neighbor, so what do I care? And that's the attitude that got us here. So we got to get back to this space of recognition that we are all parts of the one. So anything that happens to any of us, any pain experienced by anybody, is an indicator of like, okay, rebalancing needs to occur. So just again, back to the question, why does God allow suffering? Because free will is paramount. And we chose to suffer. We chose to invite suffering into this space, and we chose to proliferate it. We chose to continue it. We chose to allow that suffering to create more trauma, and that trauma to create more trauma, and it just continues from there. So somewhere along the way, somebody has to be courageous enough to end that pattern of suffering continuation, that pattern of trauma pushing onto others, and say, enough. I don't care what happens to me. I'm not going to suffer any longer. I'm going to stand up and do what's right. I'm going to stand up and say no to whatever ends, whatever happens to me. And I'm quite confident that, say we step into that space of courage and doing whatever it takes, I'm quite certain that the mechanisms of physical pain are alleviated to a large degree, perhaps all the way, if we're courageous enough to sacrifice ourselves in ways to alleviate collective suffering, to rebalancing, to bringing justice back into the space, knowing that God is good and knowing that everything in creation is aligned towards rebalancing and bringing us back into that space of bliss and balance, the Dharma, where everyone is aligned to that highest expression. To say someone throws their self in front of a car to rescue a child and they die from that car hitting them, I'd imagine in that moment they don't experience pain, a graceful exit, which would carry over that Dharma from that selfless sacrifice of preserving life and ending suffering, would be carried over into that soul signature's next lifetime, the continued expansion of that particular soul. So then we start to reverse this process of falling deeper into pain and suffering, and we move into that space of bliss. But we've just been going the wrong way for so long that we kind of forgot that we were the ones doing it all. We kind of forgot that it was us. The experience we have is just the cumulative effect of all the choices we made. It's truly just a cause and effect environment at all times. If we recognize ourselves as the cause, then the effects get to be recognized as what led to that effect. And moving forward, I can choose new causes, choose new ways